Today we're underneath the 1964 Chrysler 300K, and notice that the drive shaft boot has separated and needs to be replaced. So that'll be today's project, and we're going to show you how to replace the boot. So if you were to order a boot kit from Mark Sherman, this is what you would get. Let's see what's inside. You get a nice new flexible boot, instructions, and the correct size boot clamps. Years ago, you could get a Chrysler Universal Joint Repair Package. I happen to have a couple of them. And that way you would get your boot. And a new gasket, new end plates. That is the cross pin, and these are the universal balls and pins and the end spacers. Fortunately, we don't have to replace the pin. In my spare parts, I have a trunnion. So you can kind of see what it looks like when it's not on the drive shaft. And this leather, it may be a replacement type boot, but you can see it would fit around the drive shaft, and you would run stitching through these eyelets, and you are able to either make a repair to a boot or install a boot without having to do drive shaft disassembly, like we're going to do today. But just one of these odd things that came across in my drive shaft parts. I'm not really sure. So here's our drive shaft off. It's pretty much standard removal. 4 7/16 bolts on the rear universal, 4 9/16 nuts on the front ball and trunnion. Take the time to tape up the cups on the rear universal joint, because they're likely to fall off, and then you could lose needles. Makes your day twice as long. So now we're going to work on replacing that boot. We have the drive shafts secured in a wooden clamp, and we're getting ready for disassembly. You don't want to clamp this in something like a vise, because you can dent it. This is really just a hollow tube, and once you've introduced a dent into the drive shaft, well, now you got more problems. The grease cover is held on with, I think there's 6 of these little tabs, which we're going to pry back. It wouldn't be surprising if you're going to break one of these. It's not the end of the world, but Don't bend them any more than you need to in order to get them off. The boot clamps, well, we're going to have new boot clamps, so you don't have to worry about reusing these. You couldn't reuse them if you wanted to, because you haven't got the tool that the assembly line had in order to get these things crimped back in. So, removal of the grease cover, and I'll take off the old boot here. So I've cut off the boot, exposing the ball and trunnion, which you can kind of see in here. You'll see more of it in a minute. This is the boot that's been cut off the front. So here's a little trivia for you. How long did Chrysler use this ball and trunnion type drive shaft? Most people will tell you that 1964 was the last year. Well, the 65 letter cars with manual transmission still had the ball and trunnion with the boot. When did they first start using them? Well, I know that they got the ball and trunnion in '55, but I had the sneaking suspicion that it went back even further. So I looked under the oldest car that I have, which is 1935, and I was surprised it did not have a ball and trunnion. So I'd be interested to hear, when did Chrysler first start using this? I have the grease cover off, and you can see it's exposing the balls in the ball and trunnion. This one didn't have as much grease in it as what I generally see. You're going to want to have lots of paper towels with you so that you can mop stuff off, because it's a greasy, dirty job. Now the trunnion now gets moved backwards to expose the balls, but you want to be careful because there's pieces in here that can fall off and you don't want to lose them. So I'm going to work on the lower one first. And I'll show you what I just took off. On the top is a saddle looking piece that will slip into the grooves that you've got here on the trunnion. But under this there are spacers and needle bearings. This is the one I just took off. With the rollers removed, you expose the pin, which, if you were going to do a complete disassembly, this pin would have to be pressed out. Don't try hitting the pin with a hammer. This pin is hardened. All it will do is chip. It requires one heck of a big press in order to get this pin out. And of course, installation is tough because you've got to get the pin just dead center. Otherwise, it'll be off and you'll have a vibration. Fortunately, we're not going to mess with the pin because we're able to feed the boot through the boot over the pin and complete our repair that way. we have our nice new boot from Mark Sherman. Nice and flexible. And you'll notice it's different end for end. You sure don't want to put it on backwards, but I never have, and I make lots of mistakes. But this end at the front, this end at the back. And then the first step is just to feed it over the pin, which is probably one of the easiest things you'll do. So here's the boot, which I've wrestled over the pin, and I've got it stuck down inside the throat. It's important that you resist the temptation to use tools, because a screwdriver in here or something to pry, you can rip that boot and then you got to start over again. It also helps to have the boot a little bit warm. I sometimes run it under hot water, and that gives it a little bit more flexibility. But it's one of those jobs that's going to require getting dirty, getting greasy, and a lot of finger work. So now we continue to work the boot down through the trunnion, and this is where it'll start to get tough, because the boot won't want to go down in the trunnion, and you just have to work at it. Here we go. So we're making progress. I've worked the boot, so now it's starting to come out the bottom side. You might find the use of a stick. You might find the use of a stick handy. I just take a piece of plywood that I've got kicking around, and I'll cut a nice edge, rounded edge on it, and I'll use that for poking a little. But resist the temptation for force, because you'll puncture things. Here I have the new boot worked all the way through, and you can see it picked up the grease from the housing. So now we clean off the boot, attach the clamps, and then get into the reassembly of the balls on the front section. The service manual says to add 2 ounces of grease, which they say on the grease plate would be a ½ inch high. And you want to put half in back of the pins and half in front of the pins. So at this point, I'll add the grease to the back side of the pins. And here's your finished product. It takes, at least for me, it takes more time fiddling around getting these clamps secure, and when it's time to put the balls back in, sometimes the needle bearings want to fall out and they have to be chased around and reoriented, and you just need the patience. On this one, I had trouble with one of the balls where the needles just wanted to go everywhere, and the other one, the needles never moved. So that was an easy one to put back. So there you have your drive shaft. Once again, thanks to Mark Sherman for providing these boots. George Reel once mentioned to me that there are 2 different sizes for balls and trunnions. The high horsepower size, which is what we have here, of course, with the K, and the letter cards. And then there's a small horsepower size, which I think was the Plymouth Dart. And I believe the body is just smaller. So if you happen to run across parts in a swap meet or somewhere, make sure you are buying the right size. You want the big one, the heavy duty.